Good evening, everyone. My name is Garrett Johnson, and I'm a graduating senior from Lovell College. I'm creating this video in response to some of the comments that were made on my paper, as well as offer my final comments on my paper as well, and possibly clean up any discrepancies or any confusion that my paper may have caused. First and foremost, let me thank everyone for their comments on my paper. Those who did, I appreciate them, and I think that they helped me to reflect a little bit more on my paper, as well as get a better idea of the direction that my paper was going, as well as give me a chance to maybe reflect on a few things that I could have done better. I want to start first with the restatement of the goal in this paper. The goal for the paper that I wrote was that I wanted to prove that Buddhist practices can be used by Christians, and I think that's very important to remember. I had a few people comment some specific things about the direction or a few specific questions of things I did wrong, and a few times I found myself commenting to remember my thesis. This was very specific. I didn't want to cover anything super broad, but I was very specific with my thesis. So I would encourage anyone to review my thesis, but I did want to focus a lot more on the practices more than the beliefs. I want to first address some critiques from Abigail particularly. First, she mentioned that I had a lack of counter arguments, and she specifically said that some were mentioned briefly on pages 7 through 8 and also on page 13. And my response to that would be that there's not much discussion being had on this subject. Finding counter arguments was very difficult for this paper, and I had to almost extrapolate a little bit to find them. There were very few scholarly sources that were outright against my thesis, so I'm not sure if that ends up creating a more common knowledge or if it's just lack of research. I didn't look too far into it, but that's my side of guess how things turned out. There were some wording and clarification things that I wanted to address. On page 3, she mentioned that the writer, myself, quoted Philippians 3, 8 through 11. I will quote it right here in saying that Packer concurred with Paul that all scripture allows a Christian to better know God of the Father. Better know of God the Father. And she said that this particular scripture wasn't what Paul's referring to in Philippians. So my general response to that is that perhaps my translation was a little bit wonky here, for lack of better words. I would like to maybe rephrase this statement a little bit to say that Packer concurred with Paul and added that all scripture allows a Christian to better know of God the Father. I believe that statement more adequately addresses the point I'm trying to drive in the early parts of my paper. Further on, she mentioned that on page 7, the author quoted Paul once again, and I will quote from Colossians 3:2. She said that this reference did not back up my logic in the paragraph because Paul was writing about being eternally minded, but I was discussing mindfulness and more or less being in the present moment. And I can see how this can look confusing and a little bit out of context, but I want to remind everyone that that mindfulness can actually help an individual focus on things both on earth and things of a spiritual nature. Both of these are still referring to being mindful, and ultimately being mindful or being eternally minded is a way that a Christian can be mindful. So I wanted everyone to remember that. Also on page 8, there was a critique saying that I said that meditation is at its core of the life of the Buddhist and is used practically in the same way as prayer in the Christian religion. She tended to disagree with that claim because she says that because prayer in Christianity is far more than meditating on good things, it includes bringing requests to God and expecting Him to answer. My response to that is that I was referring to a source, specifically Edward Kahn's in his book Buddhist Meditation. Secondly, I'm not necessarily saying that prayer and meditation are synonymous nor interchangeable. I basically state that their purpose in the two religions is similar, and I expound on this throughout the whole meditation section, so I found it a little bit confusing on my part. On page 12, she noted that I quoted Philippians 2, 5 through 9 to give biblical evidence of self-emptying. And she says, I do not think that this quote was appropriate for the argument because even though the word self-empty was in the passage, Paul seemed to be talking about Christ's self-denial rather than the practice of Christ emptying himself. And I will say I'm a little bit confused by this statement because to me, self-denial is the point I'm making. To me, emptying oneself is essentially denying oneself and setting aside your preferences, desires, etc. Christians will essentially deny themselves and fill themselves with the things of God, whereas Buddhists stop at emptying themselves. So that's a clear distinction I try to make in the paper. Maybe I wasn't clear. Lastly, she mentions that on page 16 through 17, the writer described, the writer of course, described how Buddhists typically view Christianity. While it was good information to know, it was not specifically appropriate for a topic in the paper, especially since the material wasn't mentioned in the introduction. So my response to that is that I don't necessarily believe that the introduction has to include every single mention of topics in the paper. I only added this part so that I could then transition to evangelic principles. So maybe that helps clear it up, but I didn't feel like it needed to be in the introduction per se. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to address some comments from Brian in my paper as well. And I will quote his comment here. One instance that stands out is page 3, paragraph 2, sentences 3 through 7. I stated that 3 separate views of Christology, 2 being heresy, stating that Jesus was not God at any point of existence, sentences 4 through 5, and that the last sentence stating the hypostatic union. Because I never affirmed or rejected any of the 3, I assumed you were stating all 3 as truth. With a short explanation of what was wrong with the statements made in sentences 4 through 5, you would have gave the reader reason to value the hypostatic union. If that was not your goal, you could have simply left out the other 2 views and further explained the importance of Jesus being holy God and holy man. Okay, so my response to this is that I agree that I should have explained the 2 views in the paragraph to help clarify. But my point with this paragraph was to state a few of the views within Christology to help make my point that who Christ is has been thoroughly debated and discussed. I was not trying to be heretical by any means. And I state clearly on the bottom of page 3 that the subject, and I quote myself, has been debated and discussed since the 5th century. He also makes note that I have a discrepancy between stating that Buddhism is the 5th largest religion and also saying that it's the 4th largest religion. And I would like to say that this is probably because they came from 2 different sources, and it could have been the reason that there was a discrepancy there. The numbers could have also been different when the sources were written. I'd have to look at the time that both were written and see how far apart they were, but I didn't think that that was significant enough between 4th and 5th largest. It wasn't that important to me to address. And lastly, of course, as some have mentioned, my Turabian was a little off, and my apologies for that. I tend to not do as good in Turabian, so I try to do the best I can. But ultimately, that summarizes the critiques that were on my paper. Again, I thank everyone for their input, and it helped me definitely reflect more on my paper, and it ultimately will help me become a better writer. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this class, and I thank you all for your input on my papers, and I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for watching.